Magnum was founded in 1947 by Robert Capa, Henri Cartier-Bresson, George Roger, and David Seymour, known as Shim. It was founded so that the photographers would retain the ownership, the copyright of their photos, so they could resell them to other clients after the initial shoots. And this was counter to the way that business was done up until then, where the magazine had full control of the work that the photographers had done, and the photographers had no control. Magnum is basically known for individual expression and quality of work. So whether that is covering conflict or portraits or just daily life, it all falls under the standards that Magnum represents.
You know, I do have a particular, through the experience of joining Magnum, which is now, 35 years ago, being part of a collective, which is, a very democratic and humbling process because you are one of many, and it's very different to negotiate your own desires inside a community, and it's a very special experience. It's different than a family construct of a nuclear family. It's different than being on your own as an artist. The times we lived, and when we lived those times, we looked at the people who had worked before us and thought they had much better times. Because, when we think about Robert Capa, he went to Russia for 3 months, We were going for at least 3 weeks, or we were working independently and we had a whole partnership with the media to produce in the field for long-term, in-depth coverage. So that was a very privileged time in retrospect of the 70s and the 80s, which is when I was principally, out in difficult and transforming environments. So the times I lived, the times I documented, the times I witnessed, believing very much that photography played an important role to reveal, to expose, to document evidential strength of photography, is the core experience that I bring to now what I see in the context of what the Magnum Foundation is trying to do, is not so much preserve those values, but create the possibility for people to act on those values.
Susan is known partly as a war photographer and exposes terrible war crimes in El Salvador, other areas in the 1970s and 80s. She's done a lot of other work. She's done strippers in rural communities. She's done young girls growing up in the in Soho, S&M Club in New York. It's a wide range of subjects with her, so that's very interesting. She doesn't only have one category, one subject that she works with. I would say that there's a humanistic expression. Well, of course, a conflict situation is quite different from documenting daily life in New York, although that could be like a conflict as well. What Magnum in general does is shows the soul of the subject. So in that sense, it is a humanistic mission that she follows.
And I'd mostly worked nationally and domestically in the 70s when I started, and then really through Magnum saw a larger world. I mean, that's part of what they exposed me to, or created a sense that that was appropriate to explore the world. So a number of things opened up. I mean, I wasn't a plan. I also was photographing Santa Clauses in New York when I first joined Magnum, so it wasn't all running around the world. I did a lot of local work, but progressively it became much more oriented to the larger global context in which, combination of social movements and human rights issues were evolving.
Το 1978 και για ένα περίπου χρόνο η Σούζαν Μέιζελας ακολούθησε την πορεία των Σαντινίστας προς την νίκη στην επανάσταση που έγινε στην Νικαράγουα σε ένα οδηπορικό φωτογραφικό που έγινε διάσημο μέσα από ένα λεύκομα το οποίο ακολούθησε. Αρκετές φωτογραφίες αυτής της δουλειάς εντάχθηκαν στη συλλογική μνήμη της χώρας, έγιναν γραμματώσιμα ή αντίστοιχα τυπώθηκαν σε σχολικά εγχειρίδια. Το ενδιαφέρον της Σούζαν όμως για την τύχη της Επανάστασης δεν σταμάτησε εκεί. Επισκέφθηκε τη χώρα πολλές φορές ακόμη και 25 χρόνια αργότερα, το 2004, επέστρεψε και έστησε 13 από τις φωτογραφίες της σε ιδιαίτερα μεγάλο μέγεθος, στα σημεία ακριβώς όπου είχαν εκείνη την εποχή τραβηχτεί, αντιπαραθέτοντας το τότε της Επανάστασης με το σήμερα της καθημερινότητας των ανθρώπων. Η έκθεση αυτή ήταν ένας αναστοχασμός πάνω στο ίδιο το έργο της, αλλά και πάνω στα χρόνια που ακολούθησαν τα γεγονότα της Επανάστασης.
Libre de Guardia Nacional, libre de Oficina de Seguridad, libre de soplones.
I read about young people who were protesting at the time under Somoza. And I think coming out of the 60s, being a 68er myself and March on Washington and participating in my own culture's protest movement, led me to feel very comfortable with thinking about what was that protest movement. I had no vision that it was going to become a militant movement and it would be a overthrowing of a dictatorship, the first in, quite a long time in Latin America. So that became obvious, but that wasn't what I went for. I think it would have been maybe even unlikely if I just read a headline, Nicaraguan insurrection. I don't think I would have just said, oh, I'm going to go there. And we have an internet where anybody can go see the world without having to go anywhere, which is quite different. I mean, also in 78 when I went to Nicaragua, there were stories in the press, but there were no images. So I didn't know what it looked like, smelled like, felt like. I had no idea what would happen, and I stayed almost a year documenting throughout that period something transforming way beyond what anyone else would have expected or imagined. I flew in when there was nothing happening. Several months later, people flew in when the National Palace was taken, and then suddenly I was in the middle of a media world which I had never been exposed to, with all the movie cameras and the networks and the photographers coming from all over the world, etc. And they all left after a week because the event didn't lead to anything else immediately. 2 weeks later, it did. So I stayed, and an insurrection evolved, and I was there to document it. And I think that that's, classic. People talk about it, your sixth sense. You just know when to stay or when it's time to leave. That's a very critical judgment, and you maybe don't always get it right.
Στην έκθεση του 2004 που έγινε στην Νικαράγουα, η Σούζαν επέλεξε να πάρει συνεντεύξεις από ανθρώπους δίπλα από τις εικόνες, οι οποίες συμβόλιζαν στιγμές και σκηνές της Επανάστασης και είχαν αναρτηθεί στους χώρους όπου είχαν ακριβώς τραβηχτεί. Από ανθρώπους μεγαλύτερης ηλικίας προσπαθούσε να εκμεεύσει τις εμπειρίες και τα βιώματα εκείνης της εποχής και φυσικά τη γνώμη τους για το τι επακολούθησε στα 25 χρόνια ύστερα από την Επανάσταση. Από ανθρώπους νεότερης ηλικίας και ακόμη και παιδιά προσπαθούσε να εκμεεύσει αντίστοιχα μία αίσθηση του τι εντυπώσεις έχουν δημιουργηθεί στο νου τους μέσα από την εκπαίδευση σχετικά με εκείνη την περίοδο και αυτές τις φωτογραφίες. Η έκθεση Reframing History της Σούζαν Μέιζελας, 4 χρόνια μετά από την παρουσίασή της στη Νικαράγουα, μεταφέρθηκε εδώ στους κοιτώνες του στρατοπέδου Κόδρα, όπου παρουσιάστηκε στο πλαίσιο της Φωτομπιενάλε του 2008 από το Μουσείο Φωτογραφίας Θεσσαλονίκης. Η επιλογή του χώρου έγινε ακριβώς με το κριτήριο ότι εδώ υπήρξε για δεκαετίες ένας στρατώνας, ένας χώρος στον οποίο κοιμούνταν και ξυπνούσαν καθημερινά στρατιώτες. Οι ίδιες οι φωτογραφίες έδειχναν στρατιώτες και αντάρτες να πολεμούν, οπότε γεννούνταν αυτόματα έντονη συνειρμή, ενώ ακριβώς απέναντι από το χώρο στον οποίο έγινε η έκθεση υπάρχει σήμερα ένα μικρό αλλά ενεργό στρατόπεδο, αυτό της K4, η οποία έχει έρθει στη Θεσσαλονίκη για να επιβλέψει την εύθραυστη ειρήνη η οποία υπάρχει στο Κόσοβο ύστερα από την επέμβαση εκεί.
I would say use the photograph is a tricky word. I want to continue to share the photograph, but I'm not interested in sharing in the way we talk about sharing, which is just share with your friends. I'm not interested in Facebook sharing. The community from which this work came, I wanted the work to be for them, of value to them. And the first place it lived was in a museum of the history of the revolution, which now is not even there anymore. It's a collection, it's an archive, it's not open to the public. Times change. But I wanted the history to be back with and for the people who had made it, essentially. I was an observer, I was on the sidelines. So that was the first inclination, and 25 years later, it continued to be, to reflect again on what is this history? What does it mean to document history? For myself and for them. I mean, it's proactive. It's wanting the voices of people to be heard, to tell their stories.
Στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 90, 10 περίπου χρόνια μετά από το τέλος της Επανάστασης, η Σούζαν Μέιζελας επέστρεψε στη χώρα και έκανε ένα ντοκιμαντέρ σχετικά με την επίδραση των εικόνων των δικών της Επανάστασης στη ζωή των ανθρώπων, αλλά και σχετικά με την καθημερινότητα των ανθρώπων ύστερα από την Επανάσταση.
It's definitely about the people who participated when they did and how they felt 10 years later. So it's about Nicaragua, what happened in Nicaragua. It's about how I came to be there and share some of the reflections of what it felt like to be there and what I was thinking about when I was there. And I think it's about the photograph itself. What is it?
Documentary photographer will photograph human experience, and that's universal. So if somebody is dealing with a specific situation in a particular political environment, particular country, people all over the world are still experiencing the same challenges of freedom, equality. So even a photograph from 100 years ago will still resonate. The clothing might be different, things of that nature, but the emotion is the same.
Reportage of the real world doesn't sell. Those are real problems for more classic photojournalists and documentarians to consider and to think about and to be creative about. So when I go back to my own community, which is Magnum, we think about that. We've always had a kind of strategy of cross-platforms, almost all of us working in a combination of magazines to books to exhibitions to things that might be of greater interest to different kinds of publics. I'm not someone who makes pictures for walls, but my photographs end up on walls. So whether they're walls of a museum or gallery or they're the public space back in Nicaragua, that's as interesting to me. So I want that whole dialogue, that whole range.
Postcards from America is an attempt by Magnum and Magnum photographers to do a couple of things. One of them is to explore collaborations between photographers on an ongoing project. The other is to find ways to fund and sell work ourselves. Postcards from America is a way for us to get away from getting assignments from the New York Times, from Perry Match, from Der Stern, and get into producing projects ourselves, conceiving them, making them happen, and then selling the work afterwards. The first Postcards from America project took place in 2011. There were 5 photographers involved: Jim Goldberg, Paolo Pellegrin, Susan Meiselas, Mikhail Sabutsky, and Alex Soth. They basically got into a van in Texas and they drove to California, and they just improvised along the way, shot lots of photos. There was a show in San Francisco, I believe, when they arrived, and they documented what they were doing as they were doing it on a website. That website still remains up. Those 5 photographers are really the nucleus of the Postcards from America projects. There have been 2 subsequent Postcards from America projects. 10 Magnum photographers gathered in Rochester, New York. Rochester was chosen for a couple of reasons. One is that it's an interesting city in America. It's a small city. It's not a famous city. There used to be a lot of manufacturing there, part of what we call in America the Rust Belt. There used to be towns where steel was produced, but in the 1970s, a great deal of that manufacturing went offshore, went overseas. So it went from being the steel belt to the Rust Belt. But Rochester is a city that's been able to reinvent itself in many ways. There's a lot of technology there. Additionally, and more importantly, Rochester was the home of Eastman Kodak, which obviously, produced the film that all Magnum photographers, indeed all photographers all over the world, grew up shooting. Eastman Kodak went into bankruptcy recently, and they stopped producing film as well. For those reasons, we thought it was an interesting place to explore kind of collaborative storytelling. Just the kind of the legend of Rochester, like its centrality to photography, and what it said about America right now. We found that interesting.
I think if you're curious, you have to create work, you have to find space and create innovative ways to, let's say, share that work, make that work visible, make it coherent. So to move from a magazine where somebody else makes choices to a book where you make your own, to an exhibition or a film or a website, I mean, these are all explorations of what can we do to communicate whatever we think we might know about something that we can share.
Susan Meiselas is one of the few Magnum photographers that's been involved in every one of the postcards project. And she's done really interesting stuff in both Rochester and Florida, which are the most recent ones. In Rochester, she got very engaged in documenting a shirt factory. Sort of the very traditional manufacturing process in America. We're used to very sad stories about factories and factory towns such as Detroit, Michigan in America, and yet there's something of a small rebirth of manufacturing going on, so she's been an excellent documentarian of that. In Florida, she was doing quite a bit of work on election night. Florida is obviously a very important state in the peculiar way that America conducts its elections, and it was expected to be one of the deciding states. So Florida, aside from being a very strange and colorful state, has had a very interesting history in the elections, and Susan did a great deal of work just seeing, what is the texture, what is the particular visuals of, the rooms that a campaign is conducted in on election night, where the voting takes place, but also the offices where all of the campaign workers are, where they work. What is the feeling you get out of it? And through her work, she did what she was done in real time. You definitely got a feeling that Obama was going to win and Romney was going to lose, and that's actually, in fact, what happened.
I would just say we all have perspectives on truth. I'm not sure there is a truth. There are perspectives on truth. What I might know now, I might rethink 2 minutes, 2 days, 2 or 20 years later. So is it my truth today? Yes, I might believe something today, but I might rethink it. I think it's really hard to be idealistic now. I'm more skeptical. I'm more, thoughtful about how complex change is. I've seen tremendous disappointment and great aspirations. So I don't think, I don't wish for more. I just am more reflective about how complex the world is to transform deeply.
Η εργασία της Σούζαν στο Κουρδιστάν ξεκίνησε στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 90 υπό το βάρος καταγγελιών στη διεθνή κοινή γνώμη ότι χιλιάδες χωριά κουρδικά στο Ιρακινό Κουρδιστάν είχαν καεί από τις Ιρακινές δυνάμεις τις στρατιωτικές. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό η Σούζαν ξεκίνησε μία έρευνα στην πορεία της οποίας διαπίστωσε ότι ο κουρδικός λαός, παρότι αριθμεί περίπου 20 εκατομμύρια, είναι δηλαδή ποσοτικά μεγαλύτερος από αρκετές ευρωπαϊκές χώρες, είναι σπαρμένο σε 4-5 διαφορετικές χώρες της περιοχής και ως εκ τούτου ουδέποτε είχε δικό του ανεξάρτητο κράτος, ουδέποτε είχε εθνικό αρχείο ή κάποια δική του έντυπη ιστορία.
First of all, I didn't think I was doing it for them. I thought I was working with them. I went first as a photographer at the moment of crisis when the Kurds were fleeing after the the insurrection with Saddam. And so it was a very specific moment of time. What I discovered was a deeper history that I, among many others, knew very little about. So what propelled me was my own curiosity to find out more. It led to a 6+ year project collecting various perspectives on Kurdish history that came mostly from outsiders because they're the ones who had the cameras. So essentially, in some ways, I was following the leads that the Kurds gave me as to where things might be buried. If you even think about here we are 20 years later, you wouldn't go anywhere. You'd just go online and you'd start Googling Kurds and you'd find pictures in various archives. You wouldn't sit in people's backyards. They would be uploading the pictures to your website. So everything has changed. But in '91, when I began that project, one didn't know where a picture of a Kurd would be buried in an archive or in a private collection or with a family album, etc.
Η υπόθεση του Κουρδιστάν, η οποία απασχόλησε την Σούζαν και τους συνεργάτες της για μία σχεδόν 20ετία, θεωρώ ότι είναι ένα μοναδικό στο είδος του εγχείρημα στην ιστορία της φωτογραφίας. Η φωτογραφία ως τώρα αντιμετωπίζονταν ως τεκμήριο σε ένα ευρύτερο ιστορικό πλαίσιο, ενώ τώρα ξαφνικά έρχεται στο προσκήνιο σαν ένας ενεργός τελεστής της ιστορίας.
Many photographers only want their pictures to tell the stories. I am interested in the voices around and inside and embedded inside those photographs to be unleashed. And you know, I've done a lot of work with photographs and sound for that reason. So I guess that's how I see it. You know, I think it's more, you know, a kind of vision of what the whole process means. To document a moment, to reflect on it over time, to have a relationship, which is what I think a photograph really is. It's about a relationship.
Αποφάσισε να κάνει μια εντελώς πρωτότυπη δουλειά. Επισκέφθηκε πολλές από αυτές τις χώρες, τη Συρία, το Ιράκ, το Ιράν, τη Ρωσία, χώρες στις οποίες ζούσαν κουρδικοί πληθυσμοί και αναζήτησε ιστορικό, αρχαιακό υλικό το οποίο μπορούσε να βρει από αναμνηστικές φωτογραφίες, από φωτογραφίες στρατιωτικών αποστολών, διπλωματών, ιεραποστόλων, άλλο υλικό αρχαιακό, το οποίο είχε σε κάθε περίπτωση άλλες χρήσεις πριν έρθει στα δικά της χέρια και το συνάρμοσε όλο αυτό σε ένα βιβλίο το οποίο ονομάστηκε «Κουρδιστάν στη σκιά της ιστορίας», συνέχεια του οποίου υπήρξε μια ιστοσελίδα με τον ίδιο τίτλο, στην οποία ασφαλώς υπήρχε πολύ περισσότερο υλικό, αλλά υπήρχε και μια μοναδική δυνατότητα αλληλεπίδρασης του κοινού, το οποίο μπορούσε είτε να προσφέρει πληροφορίες για εικόνες που υπήρχαν, είτε να προσφέρει εικόνες οι οποίες ήταν άγνωστες μέχρι τότε και μπορούσαν να ενταχθούν στο υλικό αυτό.
And so I was interested in photography. I was interested in people participating in contributing to a collective history and creating as open a opportunity as that. And it started with collecting for the book. It then led to a website where, you know, for a number of years, the exhibition led people to bring work to upload before we had smartphones that did them. There are many threads that came together along with a technology that made it possible to do something I couldn't possibly have imagined even 7 years before when I began. So in '98, when we launched AKA Kurdistan as a website, you couldn't, it had to be managed, you know, completely different than an environment today, 10 years plus later.
Η ιστοσελίδα αυτή, η οποία είναι ακόμη σε λειτουργία, είναι ένα ιδιαίτερα ενδιαφέρον εγχείρημα σε ό,τι αφορά τη θεώρηση της ιστορίας. Στο μεγάλο πλαίσιο αυτού του εγχειρήματος υπάρχουν και σύγχρονες φωτογραφίες, τις οποίες έχει η ίδια τραβήξει από χώρους μαζικής εκτέλεσης Κούρδων, από ανθρώπους οι οποίοι εισφέρουν προφωνικές μαρτυρίες, οι οποίες εντάσσονται και εμπλέκονται με το υπόλοιπο ιστορικό υλικό, το οποίο προέρχεται από πάρα πολλές πηγές, από το 19ο αιώνα ακόμη. Είναι το είδος, θα λέγαμε, του βιβλίου που για πρώτη φορά ίσως ένας Κούρδος πατέρας ή μια μητέρα θα μπορούσε να δώσει στο παιδί του και να του πει «Πάρε ένα κομμάτι από την ιστορία του λαού σου».
I think photography is still quite important. I think people remember a still photograph much more than a moving image. It's a frozen moment that somehow it burns into the brain. and the soul. You know, the history of photography is filled with images that are just that one moment that people will remember forever.
I was very, very dedicated to doing the best documentation of the worst violence that I could ever imagine. That was my purpose. I don't think I was fearless. I think I confronted my fear by pushing through it in a way. But I also was sensitive to when I felt fear and felt there was a time to retreat. I mean, being fearless is really just, is not so much about danger. It's more about going beyond what's expected, you know? Following your own instincts about things, whether or not it's au courant or interesting to anyone else. The unknowing, the doubt, living with that, that's being fearless. I don't think it's my mission to put myself into danger. I think I accept that danger is part of what I might have to go through in order to do what I believe in doing. It's somewhat different.